was the scene of what looked like a massacre. On the front of the restaurant, a man was slumped over, just in front of the cash register, whose contents clearly have been emptied. My name is Allison, and I worked as a cashier in our small town's McDonald's when I was 18. But I don't think I can ever step in that restaurant again though. Not the fault of the business, but because it might trigger some incredibly frightening memories for me. I learned the hard way that sometimes one simple stupid choice can turn your life into a living nightmare. And this is what happened on that fateful winter day. I started my shift like any other. Breakfast is usually the busiest time of the day. By the time we reach mid-afternoon, the crowds become much more manageable. A nice young man, dressed in pretty high-end clothes, walked into the store and was really taking his time to order. He asked me what my recommendations were. That's not a question we usually get here. I hear that more in restaurants than in fast food joints, where people usually have a clear idea on what they want to begin with. I recommended the Big Mac meal. He agreed. He was a really charming man, and he complimented how clean our McDonald's branch was. Again, not a thing I usually hear in this place. Still a bit amused by this conversation, I let my guard down and stupidly answered his next question. Is Nia working today? Without thinking, I replied that she was doing the night shift. He thanked me for that and he just left. He told me I can have the Big Mac meal. I was just baffled. I didn't know what to make of it. Was this guy a friend? A jealous boyfriend? I know I had to ask Nia before I go home. Nia arrived early that night as I was just about to wrap my shift. She didn't look like her normal, happy, glowing self. She looked haggard and sad. I asked her if she was okay, and at first she responded that she was fine. I told her that a man was looking for her this afternoon. Her eyes widened, her mouth open. She looked absolutely terrified. I asked her what was wrong. She replied that she had just broken up with her boyfriend of 3 years a month ago and also has a restraining order on him. He had managed to track her. It was an intensely abusive relationship. It was not just psychological and emotional, but also physical. The boyfriend was a controlling narcissist who wanted to regiment every move she makes. He gets into almost a rabid rage when he sees her with another guy, even her own family. He was truly unhinged. I immediately knew I messed up by telling him that Nia was having her shift that night. She was understanding. She said that she will try to ask the other workers there for help in case he shows up. I asked her to call the police immediately since she already has a restraining order. I gave her my number in case she needed any help from me, and I told her that I will do whatever it takes to keep her safe. She could tell that I was feeling guilty about the entire thing, but she assured me that everything will be fine and that she doesn't blame me for anything. That night, I couldn't really sleep. I was staring at my phone, waiting for an update. At just around midnight, I called her to check if everything was fine. She answered it and told me that she couldn't really talk because it was getting busy and that she was doing well and there is no sign of the guy. She also said she will keep me posted. I had a really bad feeling. But then, I told myself it was probably just me being guilty and paranoid. The next day, I checked in for work as usual. I was smiling at customers while working the till. Then, an irate middle-aged lady comes in. She doesn't seem to be having a good day and had a general Karen vibe. She immediately went to me and said she would like to speak to the manager. Wow, This lady is something else. I haven't even taken her order or spoke to her, and she already wanted to speak to the manager? My manager, Tony, went up to the counter to entertain her. She whined about how there was an incredibly foul smell coming from behind the store. Tony explains to her that it's where our trash bins are, and we will go check. In our country, it's those large smell green bins. Tony asked one of the female crew to follow this lady to the back. I've never had a customer complain about smell before, so this was something new to me. A few minutes later, I was taking the order of an elderly couple when I hear screaming from outside.
"Call the police! Oh my God!"
they shouted. The screaming kept on going. Curious customers, including the couple I was speaking to, also rushed out, and then more screams. I walked out of the store too, leaving another guy to man the counter. There was a small group of people, all huddled, covering their noses. I looked down at the bin, and I saw it. Poor Nia, slaughtered, murdered, thrown into the dumpster. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I died a little inside. This was my fault, I thought immediately, and I just broke down crying. I failed her, all because of my one stupid decision to not protect my co-worker. The police knew immediately who the primary suspect was. They caught him in a parking lot, and instead of surrendering, the bastard shot back, perhaps to end his own life, knowing full well that the police will shoot him. He's gone now, but the pain for me is just beginning. I've been in therapy for 2 years now. I still couldn't process the guilt and grief. Ladies, don't share the location of other women to random men. That's actually the lesson I learned the hard way, which is why I'm sharing my story today. The Airbnb Jimmy rented online looked exactly like the pictures. Having traveled all over Japan, his wife, Darlene, and 7-year-old daughter, Kaylee, were on their last leg of their spring break getaway, and back home to Dallas they go. This morning, they wound up in a nice home in the small town near some beautiful hot springs. The house looked really old, but well maintained. Snow covered its once moss-colored roof. Its wooden textures made Jimmy glad that they booked this particular house, as he was looking for an authentic local experience. They were the lucky first Airbnb tenants to find this place, and so the price was a steal. They were in for a relaxing 4 days and 3 nights in this area. They dropped their stuff, Mom and Dad in one room, and Kaylee on her own. Then, they left for the town center. They had a long, busy day of touring the town center, the hot springs, and the other sites of interest. They arrived at around 8 in the evening. It was very cold, and Dad struggled to put the key into the keyhole, his hands slightly frostbitten. Kaylee was standing behind them, was staring at the second-floor window, looking distraught. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to the window. Jimmy asked her what she was referring to. She replied that there was a shadow on the window. Then, it just disappeared. Dad dismissed it, saying she must be imagining it again, as she used to have an imaginary friend. Finally, Jimmy is able to open the house, and into their rooms they go. Kaylee asked if she could sleep in their room that night, but the husband and wife refused. Kaylee was so scared, she kept the lights on and slept soundly. Then, in the middle of the night, she awoke to the sound of heavy, strained breathing. She opened her eyes and realized that the lights were now off. This frightened her, as she was absolutely sure she kept them on. Then, she heard the voice say something loudly in Japanese.
"Anata hadare,"
said the voice. She looks around the room, and there, in the doorway, there is a figure, a woman in dirty, white clothes.
"Mom?"
She called.
"Anata hadare!"
She shouted. Then, she walked forward. In the darkness, she can barely see the outline of a disheveled old woman. Kaylee closed her eyes and screamed. Her parents rushed out of their rooms, turned on the lights in the corridor, and the woman was gone. Kaylee pointed to the door while screaming. Dad looked around, while Mom rushed to comfort her. There was no one there. Dad was standing in the spot where the woman stood. He told his daughter it might have been just a nightmare. He tells her that she can sleep in the same room as them that night. Then, he stops in his tracks, looks down, and sees that there seems to be a puddle of water where he stood, about the size of footprints. They finally managed to get some sleep for the rest of the night. Darlene was taking a shower. She was delighted that such traditional old house had hot running water. While she was busy putting on shampoo, she suddenly screamed in pain as she felt it. A rough, sudden pain on her left wrist. There were deep scratch marks. There was very little blood, but it was red and painful. She looked around the shower, and there was no one there. But on the glass, there was an outline of a hand in the steam. This scared her. She started airing her concern to her husband. She's starting to believe that there is something really wrong with the house. Jimmy can no longer dismiss their concerns. He sat down with his wife and daughter, and together, they started looking for other Airbnbs, but everything was fully booked. He managed to find a small hostel that looked tiny, but it was better than this place. However, they could only move there at noontime the next day, so they had to sleep in the house for the night, as it was freezing outside. While Jimmy didn't fully buy their stories, he was respectful of what the two ladies experienced, so they all moved their stuff from the upstairs room, where the bathroom is located and where Kaylee saw the woman. They huddled together on the floor downstairs, near the staircase. This was not what they had hoped for their vacation. They managed to finally fall asleep. But then, they all hear it. A loud groan from upstairs. A sound like whimpering. It was echoing all over the house. Jimmy opened his eyes and pulsed down his blanket. The sound stopped. He is now staring at the ceiling, waiting, listening for the sound. For a short while, there was nothing. Then, the wailing, the sound of a woman howling, crying. He thought he was in a nightmare, but he stood up. Then, a hand suddenly grabbed him. It was Kaylee.
"Daddy, no, I hear her too."
Jimmy was not sure if it was a ghost or an intruder, so he grabbed an umbrella and got ready for a fight. He walked slowly towards the stairs, Kaylee looking on worried. He turned to the corner and saw two dirty feet, some liquid in between them, falling from inside the skirt of a decomposed old lady. Is she peeing? She stared at him intently, and in the blink of an eye, she was in front of him, crying, bloody, decomposing, and angry. He tried to scream in terror, but no words came out of his mouth, and he fell, collapsing on the floor, hitting his head on his way down. He wakes up to paramedics taking his vitals inside the home. They tell him he collapsed in the middle of the night, but Kaylee and Jimmy knew what really happened. The owner of the Airbnb on the phone speaking to his wife. His wife crying. Jimmy asked what was going on, and the real story emerged, equally sad and horrifying. The house was the ancestral home of the young owner. His mother and father lived there for decades. He was raised there. As his old mother started suffering from dementia, it became too much for him, and he left her in that house, with only a nurse to take care of her. The nurse got fed up as well and abandoned the old lady. She died alone, scared and in despair, angry that she had been forgotten. Her body was found 2 months after she died. No one bothered to check on her. The son just cleaned the home and put it up for rental afterwards. He profusely apologized for their experience and just offered a refund instead. My name is Olga, and I remember vividly this warm February night in the early 2000s when the scariest thing in my life happened to me. I'm still in therapy from it because of the nightmares due to the post-traumatic stress disorder. I was driving my sister, Ingrid, and we were coming from a late-night party. We were tired and hungry from a small room party that ran out of food pretty early, but had an abundance of alcohol. I had sobered up an hour ago, while Ingrid was practically passed out in the back. I was confident enough to drive, thinking that my blood alcohol level was low enough, such that if we were stopped, I could pass a sobriety test. I asked Ingrid if she wanted to drive through to a nearby McDonald's. She said, mumbling, "Yeah, sure." In my city, there were several 24-hour McDonald's branches, which really was our only option at 2 in the morning. So we drove halfway across town into the restaurant. We arrived there, nothing out of the ordinary. There was only one really run-down old truck in the entire parking area. Nothing notable, really. There was no line of vehicles going through the drive-thru window. This was great. I was eager to get my food and go home. I drove up the ordering area, opened my window, and spoke into the microphone attached to the menu.
Hello, I'd like to order a Big Mac meal and a quarter-pounder meal, please.
I waited for a response. There was none. I spoke a little louder.
Hi there. Sorry if you didn't hear me. I'd like to order a Big Mac meal and a quarter-pounder meal, please.
Just eerie silence. Ingrid got fed up with this, rose from her apparent slumber, and quickly pulled down her window. She spoke loudly, almost shouting.
Hey! We really need to get home, babe. Can you sell me my burger, please?
No answer.
Maybe they're closed,
Ingrid said, but the lights were open. Odd. I drove the car to the window where they give you your order. It was strangely wide open, but there was no worker visible inside.
Weird. Maybe they're short on staff,
I remember saying. Ingrid answered,
Yeah, let's just pop in and order and be done with this crap.
I agreed. We drove the car back to the parking lot, parallel parked to the old truck. We walked to the McDonald's as I'm trying to keep Ingrid from falling down. I even asked her if she preferred to stay in the car, but she was pretty insistent that she was fine. We walked into the door of the restaurant and was greeted by the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my entire life. The members of the staff were all sprawled all over the floor. They were all lifeless. There was blood everywhere, some of it pouring out of their eyes, their mouths, and their chests. It was the scene of what looked like a massacre. On the front of the restaurant, a man was slumped over, just in front of the cash register, whose contents clearly had been emptied. We were paralyzed, stunned. Then Ingrid let out a large scream. I said, "We should get out of here and call the police." My words were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a gun cocking. I turned around and saw, just outside the restaurant, there was a man and a woman, both wearing face coverings. Ingrid turned around, hands raised, and begged,
Please! We didn't see your faces! We didn't see anything!
The man didn't look convinced and pointed the gun at her. Then, Ingrid said it.
My friend is pregnant! Please spare us! We won't report to the police, we promise!
I was gobsmacked. I wasn't pregnant. The woman asked me if it was true that I was pregnant. And I said yes. A month. And I was about to get married to my fiancé. All made up on the spot from the drunk ramblings of my friend. The woman told the man not to do it. He argued that we might report them, but I swore on my baby's life that we would not do that. The baby that didn't exist in the first place. The woman told me that she had to do this because she had her own babies at home, twins, and they didn't know how to feed them. In my mind, this was a pathetic attempt to justify the evil that they have done, but I played along and pretended like I was on their side. There was a tense silence before the man decided to lower his weapon and let us leave. I thanked them, and we walked away, still shaking. Ingrid is now fully sobered up. We get to the car and drive away from the place. While on the dark road to the highway, both of us were in tears, traumatized from what we had experienced. And then, the bright light hit my eyes. The truck was running after us, speeding behind us. The windows were rolled down, and the woman with crazed eyes was shouting,
You have no ring!
It clicked immediately that if I had a fiancé, I would be wearing an engagement ring. And maybe it didn't sink in for her at the time, but she realized it after that I wasn't wearing one. I couldn't really see the truck clearly, but it did look like it was gaining on us. Then, part of my windshield in front of me exploded. There was a bullet hole on it. I had to do it. I had to take a risk to save our lives. I swerved on the opposite lane into the oncoming traffic. The truck went ahead as we dodged the incoming cars and vans. Convinced that we would die, I spun the car around and managed to turn it the other way, and we sped off into the opposite direction. We looked for the nearest police station and reported everything. Fortunately, drunk Ingrid, surprisingly reliable, was able to take note of the truck's plate number. The two murderers were eventually arrested in their small tenement home. The woman didn't only have one pair of twins. She had 11 kids, all of which are now going into foster care. A year later, they were sentenced to life in prison. I still haven't partied at night. I can't even drive anymore. My life will never be the same, even though it's been so long. But despite that, I am thankful for the random, drunk, quick-thinking friend of mine. If it wasn't for her, I'd probably be one of the bodies that they found in that McDonald's that cold February night. Dawn, Mark, and Justin finished setting up their cozy little bonfire in the clearing. The woods around them were silent that Halloween night. All three were dressed in their Halloween costumes, and their candy stash sitting right there beside them. Mark and Dawn welcomed Justin into their group. Usually, there are 6 of them who regularly meet up in the circle. They were inspired by a horror TV series where young friends would sit around and tell scary stories in the dark. Their little group was not interested in ghosts or monsters. Instead, they talked more about scary, true crime, horror stories. The lurid details of horrific acts interest them more than the supernatural. Justin is Don's friend, who tagged along. They just moved into the neighborhood from the big city. Justin guaranteed that he had some really good chills to share, as the city had its share of crazy tales. And so, even though everyone and all their other friends called it a night, the 3 decided to meet up. Besides, no better time to scare people than tonight. Halloween horror stories are the best. Mark started. This story happened in the Midwest this month. Trish and May were on their way to a college Halloween party in early October. They were wearing the most obvious costume of the season, Squid Game. Trish was wearing the Squid Game robot doll, while May was content to don the worker costume, her face invisible. There were many early Halloween parties throughout the month, and May wanted to maximize them because she was finally free. Free from a 4-year toxic relationship with an abusive boyfriend, Maddie. Trish was absolutely crucial in her escape from that relationship. She assisted May by calling her parents, convincing them that something was wrong, and physically driving her friend away from Maddie, who was also fallen to alcohol addiction. May held her hand all the time, Trish becoming her comfort zone, a place of refuge for her. Finally, they arrived at the party, and it was a lot of fun. There was great music, the crowd was wild, and the party was the bomb. May took off her mask as she drank on a small round table while chatting with Trish. When May took off her mask, Trish could still see the parts of the black eye that was now healing. But tonight was different. She finally saw May smile after a long time. Then, May stopped, startled. She accidentally poured her drink on her dress. Trish asked what was wrong. May smiled and said she was just getting paranoid. She thought she saw Maddie. Trish said that this is impossible, since he was in another city entirely. Plus, if he ever shows up, they have a restraining order against him. May laughed. She was being silly, she thought. She put her mask on and said she had to go to the bathroom to clean up. Trish offered to go with her, but May said she would be fine. Trish stayed in the table and finished her drink. A few minutes later, she sees May at the door, beckoning her to leave. Even if Trish couldn't see her face, she could tell that May was in a rush. Trish realized what was going on and thought that Maddie could be in the crowd. She rushes out with Trish, leaving her drinks and the table empty. 3 minutes later, May arrives at the table. She takes off her mask and started looking around, wondering where Trish could be. She asked some people around her if they saw her leave. After asking several people, someone replied,
Oh, the Squid Game robot girl! Yeah, I saw her go out with someone wearing the same costume as you.
May's jaw dropped. She rushed out of the club and looked around. She ran through the streets, shouting Trish's name. She hears it from the dark alley. Maddie's voice. She's here," he said. She sees Maddie in the same costume as hers. Being a skinny guy himself, it was easy to confuse him with May. Trish's face was bashed in. Maddie looking at her, his costume dripping with blood, holding a bloody knife, and sitting beside Trish's lifeless body. He tells her they were meant to be. He removes his mask, and he is crying, his face looking disheveled and very much haggard. "Our love was perfect. She was just pushing us apart. Now that she's gone, we can be together again." May herself was crying, but then she nodded her head. She agreed with Maddie, telling him that yes, she still loves him. She apologized for everything she did. Maddie was overjoyed. May ran to his arms, and they share a hug. May then angrily bites at his ear, tearing it off. The pain makes Maddie fall to the ground. May grabs the knife and proceeded to stab and stab. For Trish, she thought, and for my freedom. The robot doll face is now covered in blood as she held on to the same knife that took her friend's life. Back at the campfire, Justin said that it is his turn, and he guaranteed them that they will never hear a scarier story than this. He insisted that this was actually a true horror story. People in his town are still haunted by this creepy Halloween tale. 5 years ago in a city block, 2 brothers were trick-or-treating. Justin was 8, and Tyler was 10. Their single mom was working 3 jobs, and so she gave them permission to trick-or-treat as long as they don't go very far. In their town, there is this old house, rumored to be haunted. Yet, Tyler insists that there was someone living there. They pass through several houses, hauling their candy collection. Then, they pass by the supposed haunted house. Tyler told Justin that they should have fun and knock, then run. Kids do this a lot during Halloween, and some people do find this rather annoying. Justin vehemently disagreed. He said if there were ghosts there, then he would be especially in danger tonight. Tyler told him he can stay there on the street if he wants. He was going for it. Tyler climbed the tall, mossy brick wall, and Tyler was left in the street. For a short while, Justin was very anxious. He peeked through the gate, but could barely see anything as it was covered in vines and leaves. He saw his brother approach the house, looked back at him, and smiled. Then finally, Tyler was in the door of the house. He rings the doorbell. Nothing. Tyler looked back at Justin and shrugged. Justin felt relief at that moment. But then, the door opened. A big hand reached out and snatched Tyler. Justin screamed loudly. He ran across the street to some trick-or-treaters. He told the parents what happened. A mom just told him to stop it, because now is not a good night for pranks. They wouldn't believe him. He approached another group, where the dad asked him what was wrong. He explained what happened, and because of the noise, it was hard for the guy to fully grasp what was happening. Instead of wasting any more time explaining, he just drags the guy by the hand and brings him to the house. The man quickly spoke to other people and told them to come. But they were too late. When they got to the house, they realized that the backside of the house had a hole in the fence. Whoever took Tyler was gone. What remained were parts of his mummy costume on the ground. In the hole of the fence, there is another scrap of the mummy costume with some blood on it. That was the last time Tyler was ever heard from. Rumors around the town swirled. There were some sightings of him with a roving group of criminals apparently, but those are just rumors. Wherever Tyler is now, they will never find him again. Don was very impressed with Justin's story, whereas Mark said he was underwhelmed. Justin asked why. Mark said that the ending was just that he was abducted and that's all. Lots of kids get abducted. This is so common. Justin smiled and replied,
But you see, the story is ongoing. Sometimes you just have to do what it takes to survive. Sometimes you need to play along and do stuff you're not happy with. Sometimes you have to be bad to live.
Don asked what exactly he's talking about. Justin replied,
On Halloween night, it's harder to catch people, you know? It's harder to identify suspects. And that's what I learned when I knocked at that house that day.
Mark laughed and said,
Nice twist to the story. Very different.
Justin replied,
I don't think you understand. This is not a story. This is my Halloween story. I was once called Tyler, you know?
Suddenly Justin and Dawn are surrounded by men with duct tape and rope. Justin smiled.
And now...
Dawn and Mark are crying as their mouths are covered in tape.
It's your story too.
In the countryside of a small European state, cousins Miles and Ryan were two active 14-year-old boys who had the night alone as their parents attended a wedding. They tend to be pretty independent and had no need for a babysitter. And so, they spent their night playing video games on the PlayStation. 3 hours into it, they eventually get bored. It was beginning to get dark outside, and Miles decided it would be a good idea to invite Ryan to use the Randonautica app to look around in the nearby woods. It was twilight when they started their trek. They go deep into the woods when the skies became gloomy all of a sudden. The rumbling of thunder in the distance pointed to possible rain. They try to run to find cover as it got dark. Fortunately for them, Randonautica points them to a structure in the distance. They run towards it. As they grow closer, Ryan tells Miles that he has a bad feeling about this. They turn on their flashlights now. It looks like a dilapidated old orphanage. The walls are mossy and it looks like a pre-war structure. Ryan complains that the house smells rotten. Miles dismisses it and tells him, of course, they're in the forest, things die there. As the rain falls outside, Miles and Ryan take turns telling each other scary stories, lighting their faces with flashlights as they spin creepy tales of ghosts and serial killers. As they're busy doing this, they are interrupted by the sound of footsteps. They stand up. "Who's there?" Ryan says. No one responds. Miles says, "Maybe it's just our imagine..." He's interrupted. "What are you doing here?" shouts a hoarse woman's voice. They aim their flashlight forward and see a dirty, haggard woman with red eyes and long hair and fingernails rushing towards them. "Get out!" she screams. She runs towards the boys and they scream and try to run away. She's shouting the name Frank as she lunges forward. She gets Miles by the shirt as they both fall to the ground. She pulls him closer and grabs his arm, her fingernails digging deep into his skin. As he tries to pull away, her fingernail creates a long, jagged wound. Ryan tried to pull Miles away, but he's interrupted by the imposing figure of Frank, a giant of a man standing behind him, his glassy red eyes staring down on the boy. He looks disoriented and spaced out. Everyone basically stopped and just looked at him, including the woman. Miles manages to stand up, basically pissing himself at this point. "Hey, do you have any Coke?" Frank asks. Ryan shakes his head, but Miles says yes. Ryan stares at Miles in disbelief. Miles fakes confidence. Of course we do, but we finished the ones we brought here, so if you want, since you allowed us to stay in your place, we'll just go home and get you some. Frank thinks about it. There's a tense silence. You sure, bro? I mean, we can share. Miles smiles. Sure, I would love to. Just give us a few minutes to get home, and we'll give it to you. Yeah, Frank says. They move away slowly. Then they start to walk away. Ryan trips and falls. As he raises his head, he tries not to scream. He tripped on a decomposing human corpse. The corpse had a long gash on his neck. It looks like it was slit. This was the source of the smell. Miles sees it, looks back at the two and gives them a thumbs up, and they go into the forest. They walk away now. The two druggies seen in the window staring at them. Then the woman just runs after them. Hey! Ryan wants to run, but Miles stops him. Miles smiles and says, yeah? I know where you live. You better give it to us or we will kill you. Okay? Of course, Ryan says. We're not liars, Miles replies, crossing his fingers behind his back. The woman calms down and goes back inside, looking at them expectantly. They make a run for it. They run as fast and as carefully as they can. Eventually, the boys make it out of the forest and back home. They immediately report it to the police. The decomposed body was that of another druggie friend was discovered. These two were clearly violent, and Ryan and Miles only narrowly escaped. The two were never caught. At night, Ryan hears tapping on the windows, and when it rains outside, he could swear he could see two shadows outside. Maybe they are still there, just waiting for the right time to strike.